just before we have a few questions, welcome to those joining us online. I forgot to mention you guys earlier, but welcome to those joining us online. It's great to have you here tonight as well. Now, Steve, obviously you were here this morning, and some of these people would already recognise you. They go, "Oh, I'm sure I've seen that guy around. Was it like 4 hours ago or something like that?" But for those who didn't get the opportunity to meet you this morning, you work for Baptist World Aid, which is an organisation that we as a church partner with in a number of different ways. But tell us a little bit about how long you've been working for BWA and I suppose maybe some news in terms of stuff that's kind of going on in your world and focusing on at the moment.
Yeah, great. So, so I've been working for Baptist World Aid for 2 years now. Before that, I pastored churches all over the place, and I had a role for a little while with the Baptist churches of South Australia as well as a regional minister. But I love my work with Baptist World Aid, and I love getting around to churches. And really, the thing I love doing most is thanking churches for their support. I mentioned this morning I couldn't quite remember the number. I went home and went back to the room and did some homework. So in the last 2 years from Alice Springs Baptist Church, so all the support that we know about. So people who support the Nepal Partnership, people who support child sponsorship, disaster appeals, matching grants, all the different things that we do. $54,000 has come out of Alice Springs Baptist into Baptist World Aid, which makes a huge difference overseas. We work really hard to leverage that money and make every dollar worth more than it actually is. And so you're a really generous congregation. And just to hear already the way you're supporting people in Nepal in other organisations, not just us, that just speaks volumes for how generous you are. So we're doing a stack of stuff in Nepal right now. That's one of our focus areas. I said this morning do you guys partner with INF or you have connections with INF? Yeah. So we've just last week approved, and tomorrow we'll transfer $100,000 to INF Nepal to do some work, especially around their hospitals and their healthcare, and particularly looking after their staff. So providing PPE for their staff, providing emotional and psychological support and counselling for their staff, and providing accommodation and food for their staff as well, so that they can continue to do the things they do on the front line. So that's just a short-term thing, just the funding just for this month, and then next financial year, of course, we're running a COVID appeal for India and Nepal and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, and we'll certainly be sending more funds and directing more funds into that as well.
So, like, how big is Baptist World Aid? I know I'm just asking random questions that we haven't pre-planned. But how big is it? Because we know that you do work in a number of different countries. Yep. No doubt you've got a team. Is it based in? Where is your team based?
So, head office is in Sydney, but we do have a South Asia office based in Bangladesh as well. We have a few staff over there who are all in lockdown, and was chatting to them last week. They're in lockdown and they're really struggling. Lots of our staff and lots of our partner staff actually in lots of countries have been diagnosed with COVID or have family and friends who have died of COVID, so it's pretty difficult for them. But we have about equivalent of, I think, 80 equivalent full-time staff working for Baptist World Aid, mainly based in Sydney. But we work in, if I get the numbers right, 18 countries with 42 different Christian partners and over 84, 85 different programs. So it's a fairly big organisation. We pull a big weight in terms of Baptists. We're the largest. We guys should be proud of this as Aussies. Australian Baptist World Aid are the largest Baptist aid and development organisation out of all the Baptist family right across the world. And so we lead that. We have people coming from other countries to look at what we do. And our chair, our CEO, John Hickey, is also a vice chair of the Baptist World Alliance, and we're involved in shaping international policy from tiny little Australia, which is amazing.
That is absolutely amazing. So, I mean, fantastic work. Now, in a little bit of time, actually, just to kind of give you a little outline of how this is going, we're going to be doing a little bit kind of an interview / sermon, kind of reflecting a bit upon John 9, and we actually will provide an opportunity for a bit of Q&A if our time allows. But I suppose one question I had for you is, out there in the foyer, you've got a table with some different bits and pieces on it, but I'm always kind of curious, whenever you've got a table in the foyer of the church, what is the question you want people to ask you? You know, when you're standing behind that table and people are approaching, like, what is the question you really would love someone to ask?
There's two questions. One is, how do I give you $1 million? That's a great question. I've never been asked that yet, but I'm open.
Make it count.
Yeah. Look, I think the question that I like being asked the most is, how is Baptist World Aid different to other organisations?
Well, at the risk of no one asking you that question, can you respond to
you
that now?
You want to ask it? Maybe I can tell that story from this morning that I was going to.
I'd love
that
you
I
to.
didn't. If we could flick the slides up to keep going. There's a picture. Nope, keep going.
Spoilers.
There we go. No, back one. There we go. Excellent. So I think to answer it succinctly, Baptist World Aid are different because of the approach. We really believe we are doing world's best practice in community development and aid and development overseas, and in particular with our the way we do child sponsorship is very different to most organisations. We make sure that if you sponsor a child with us, the money doesn't go to the child, the money goes to the community. And so we don't pay for kids' education, we don't pay for hospitals, we don't pay for healthcare. We are paying for healthcare right now in disaster relief space with COVID, but we work really hard on helping communities to become sustainable for themselves. And this is my favourite story. In February last year, I was in Cambodia visiting some of our projects, taking some pastors and leaders to visit. And the lady on the right there in the purple cardigan, we met her. She's standing in her veggie patch. She is married. Her husband is a truck driver who travels all over Cambodia and Thailand trying to get seasonal work when he can. Doesn't earn very much. And she had this small veggie patch. And she has 3 children, and they live in a house that you can't see in this photo, but they live in a house that's probably about 3 metres by 3 metres square, just knocked together with some timber on stilts about probably a metre and a half off the ground. No real door, just a doorway with like a sheet or a blanket sort of hanging in front of it. And one of the guys that came with us on the trip said, "That looks like the cubby house I built my kids in the backyard." Now that's the sort of standard of housing. The veggie patch she has there is a lot bigger now than it was, but her original veggie patch was smaller than that, and it was also not only the veggie patch but also the family toilet. And so her kids were sick all the time because they ate food that they'd also been using as toilet. So you can imagine the difficulties in that. So her 3 children were sponsored by Australian sponsors, and they joined a program that enabled them to be part of a kids club, enabled them to be part of some other programs in their school, some leadership development programs. And as part of that, Mum and Dad got to be part of the community development program as well. And so we did some work with them, teaching her how to do better farming, how to fertilise her crops better, how to grow her crops better. And she started to make some money. And she used some of that money to join our saving crew. Now, I briefly talked about that this morning. We call it a table bank. And the villagers, they come and they sit around and they have this amazing opportunity that we seed fund with $300, which really isn't much money. And they contribute to it monthly or weekly or however much, whenever they earn. And they can also borrow back from that. And so this lady borrowed some money from that fund, and she bought a couple of pigs, and she bred those pigs, and she bred those pigs, and she bred those pigs, and as I like to say, she found out the pigs breed like rabbits, and she had a whole heap of pigs, and eventually, after a few years, she sold those pigs, and if we can go to the next slide, she bought 2 cows. And again, she bred those cows and bred those cows and bred those cows, and cows breed like pigs who breed like rabbits. And she, in that photo, you can't see them very well, there's 10 cows in that photo. She did have 15 cows, but before we got there, a few months before, she'd recently sold 5 of those cows for $700 each. And with that money that she got from the cows, if you can go to the next slide, she's building her new house. There are a couple of her kids. I can't show you their faces because of privacy stuff and all those issues, but that's her new house. They have a toilet they have it's an amazing house that's probably finished by now. And she now volunteers as a health worker in her community, teaching other mums and other families about health and hygiene. And so the whole village becomes transformed. And what does it cost us? It costs us $300 to seed fund that program, plus, of course, the support of the local workers and stuff on the ground. And so that's the model we use to try and change things from the ground up. Sustainable, working alongside, working with, rather than working from above. And so I think we do that as good at, if not better than most other organisations. So that's the question I love being asked most.
Fantastic. Well, look, we're going to kind of transition a little bit. Now, for those of you here this morning, you got to hear Steve share on John chapter 9, and we're going to kind of work with that a little bit tonight. I'd love to kind of just touch on some of the things that you spoke about, kind of restate a few things and kind of explore them even with a little bit more depth. But one of the things you kind of started off by sharing with us was that what we generally kind of perceive as poverty, or perhaps historically have kind of considered to be poverty, actually requires some redefinition. And because I suppose that kind of classic sense of poverty is often considered around, personal wealth, access to, hygiene, food, these kind of things that, were circulated in many and various ways by many different organisations across TVs and whatnots for many, many years. But yeah, it's changed, or at least maybe it hasn't changed, but maybe it's been re-explored, re-examined. There's bigger dynamics at play. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, great. If we could go back to about the second slide, just so they can come up. Sorry, I made you jump around. There we go. Look at that.
Thanks,
beautiful. You're right. We've often talked about, certainly when I was growing up in church and just in society, we've often talked about poverty as just people lacking something, not having enough, don't have enough money, don't have enough food, don't have enough water, don't have enough shelter. But I think what we're trying to rediscover and restate, find new ways of talking about poverty is perhaps, if poverty was a story, there's a whole heap of characters in that story. And so there's all sorts of poverty. So there is physical poverty where people lack physical resources or shelter or some stuff for their body. But there's also psychological, mental poverty that comes from being trapped in oppression or trapped in poverty for a long time. I don't know if you've met people that have been trapped in poverty for a long time. It can actually have severe psychological effects on them. Spiritual poverty, that not only because we have broken relationship with God, we all know that, and we're working in that place, but also that we have spiritual systems that keep people trapped in poverty, especially in other countries. Some of the other religions have systems that keep people trapped in poverty. For example, the caste system in India, where people are born into a place in society, and the spiritual system says that's where you're stuck now. That's who you're going to be for the rest of your life, and identifies them. So there's spiritual poverty. There's relational poverty, relationships with ourselves, within ourselves, but also with our family, with our spouse, relationships in communities. When we were in Cambodia, that village that we were at, where I showed you those photos from, is right up on the north near the Thai border, and it's one of the last key hotspots of the Khmer Rouge, and it's still everywhere around that village. There are landmines everywhere, and there are kids running around, adults running around who got missing arms and legs and stuff where they've had interactions with landmines. But those savings groups that I've talked about, where people trust each other with their money, in a few of those savings groups we talked to, the people sitting around the table, some of those people had relatives that were killed by the Khmer Rouge, and some of those people were in the Khmer Rouge. Wow. And some of the work we do is that reconciliation work of people fixing those relations and trusting each other enough with their money to be accountable to each other. So that's
amazing.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. And systemic poverty. So the political systems, the global systems, the fashion industry. 41 million people just in Bangladesh alone work in the fashion industry. Kmart, our fashion guides are out there on and I think Kmart have changed their whole buying. Everything they buy now, they use our guidelines that we developed for their purchasing. So you can buy anything from Kmart knowing that's actually ethically done. And that supply chain affects 500 million people around Southeast Asia. So those sort of structures as well contribute to poverty.
For those of you who haven't actually had an opportunity to look at the Baptist World Aid Ethical Fashion Guide, you release it every year.
Yep. So there's an interim one that's out there, which is our COVID guide from last year. It's a bit different, but there's a new one coming out September.
Yep.
And there's also a new thing coming out really soon in the next couple of weeks, where you can do a quiz online and see how much of an ethical shopper you actually are. I'm a bit scared to do it personally.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah. Every time I buy something, my kids go, "Where did you buy that from, Dad? Do your bosses know?" And we're also bringing out a new app as well in September that the whole guide will be really online and accessible as well.
I'm just hoping it has kind of real time, you just kind of scan across the shelves and just big red crosses or like green,
Look, I'll suggest that.
I'm sure
that the finance department will be thrilled to develop that sort of thing.
Brilliant. So yeah, I mean, and like you say, this is holistic. This is holistic, and you mentioned this morning this concept of shalom, which Hebrew word, which is not just which we often translate as peace, but peace isn't just the absence of conflict, is it?
No. So that Hebrew word shalom actually has this sense of well-being, of everything being right, of everything in its right place, of abundance and joy and freedom and overflowing goodness. And so that's what God originally created the world to be, and of course we know because of sin that's all broken now, but we know it's also what God is working back to, and we get to participate in helping him do that.
Absolutely, and that obviously shapes the overall vision of Baptist World Aid, which I think is on the next slide.
Oh, look at that, you remember. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. Look at that. You might have to just preach.
Oops.
Maybe one more.
That's good too, but here we go.
There we go. We dream of a world where poverty's ended and all people enjoy the fullness of life.
Fullness of life. Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose with that fullness of life in mind, let's pivot a little bit. The classic word of 2020.
Oh man, there's rules in Baptist World Aid.
I know, but nevertheless, we're going to pivot into John chapter 9. Now, I know this morning you had the Bible there and you were reading it from the Passion version. Was that you were saying? But rather than read it completely out, I'm going to ask us to do a little bit of a kind of a summary, because obviously what we've got is we've got a setting where things aren't shalom, things aren't as God intends them to be, where there is poverty in all those kind of different various kind of ways. If you can be so bold, do you want to try and recall and kind of set the scene of what's going on in John chapter 8 and 9, kind of the movement that goes kind of there?
Oh, okay. Chapter 8, we're going even earlier.
Well, we talked about how chapter 8 framed chapter...
9 framed chapter 10.
9 chapter 10, sorry.
Yeah, I worked backwards. So that's all right.
Got me out there.
Yeah, no, that's right. So let's just talk about chapter 9, hey? Yeah. So there's this amazing story that I've read for years, and it's only in the last few months it's really changed. I've really seen some new things in it. But we've got this blind guy who is trapped in all sorts of systems of poverty. He's trapped, he's a beggar because of his disability. But he's also, because of that, trapped in some religious systems that want to attribute the blame for that. So why is it, the disciples themselves asked Jesus, who sinned that this man is born blind? There's obviously some reason that he's not well. If everything was right and God was blessing him, then he wouldn't be suffering and he wouldn't be disabled. So we can tell God's blessing isn't on him because he's blind. So therefore, what's wrong? And Jesus wants to deal with that. There's probably broken relationships with his parents because of the shame that comes with that. And there's certainly he's on the outer of his community as well.
Absolutely. And I suppose even just that sense of going, hey, something is wrong there. Whose fault is it?
Yeah.
That's certainly not something that's just limited to this story by
Absolutely
all means.
not.
Like, you must see that, well, we all see this in different ways, but particularly working with broken communities, like, that must be so prevalent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there is something innately human in us that wants to put people in boxes. And if someone's different to us, especially if someone is suffering, we often want to attribute that to something. And often we attribute it to the person themselves or to maybe their family. We very rarely step back and attribute that to maybe the system they're in or something else bigger that's going on.
Absolutely. And so I suppose the story continues. The disciples ask this question and Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sin, but many different translations. But essentially, God's going to do a work in this moment, and that's why this man is here.
Yep.
And what does Jesus do? And the man himself explains it several times in this story. But tell us a little bit about what Jesus does.
Jesus does this crazy thing, right?
Yeah.
He spits in some mud and puts it on, spits in the dirt and makes some mud and puts it on this guy's eyes and says, "Now go and wash in the pool." And this guy does it. We don't even know why he does it. That's a whole sermon in itself right there. And he goes and as he washes the clay off of his eyes, and as he starts coming back to the village, he gets to see. And the Passion Translation says, for the first time in his life, his eyes are opened and suddenly everything is different for him.
Absolutely. And it would be a nice end to the story right there, a little bit, except for this guy doesn't actually truly know. He knows what happened to him, but he didn't really know who happened to him in that moment.
No, and so then there becomes this whole community thing going on. We're talking a small community, maybe 500 people at the most, maybe even less than that. So everyone knows him, and suddenly he's different. And we don't know why he's different. Obviously he can see, but maybe sometimes blind people, their eyes are completely white, and maybe his eyes look different. Maybe his face, I'm sure his face looks different. He's probably smiling. Or probably looking around puzzled. If you've never seen anything before, it must be so overwhelming. But what's fascinating is even as they keep trying to deal with that and make sense of it, they keep marginalising him. So first of all, the people in the community are just sort of having this conversation. Is that the guy that was born blind? Oh, I think it is. Oh no, well it looks like him. And he's just standing off to the side, and eventually he sort of chips in and goes, "Yeah, it is me. Hello." I'm here.
Nothing like people talking about the miracle that occurred to you over there, as if like you're not a valid witness to what took place.
And so much what happens with people who are trapped in poverty, the same thing, or people who are marginalised. We often talk about them without listening to them, without including them in the conversation. I mean, it's the same as what we're dealing with in Australia as part of reconciliation issues and all those things. We want to have conversations about people. We never want to have conversations with them. And
why do you think that is? So I'm just going to throw that in there.
Good question.
Why do you think that is?
There's lots of answers. There's simple answers and there's judgy answers.
We'll start with the simple.
Yeah. I think it's because, what's happening in the story with all the different groups of people that marginalise this guy is we all have preconceived ideas. And so we want to use our own intellect. We want to work it out for ourselves. And sometimes we want to do that. Sometimes we think, I need to work it out first and come to a decision before I have that conversation with someone. I need to understand. Often it's because we just like to be in control and we like to make up our own minds.
That's right. Just name it. We like being in control. That's true.
And the next time that happens when they bring him before the Pharisees and the same thing happens and the Pharisees are having this conversation, they don't even want to talk about whether he's got his eyesight back or not. They want to talk about how it happened, who did it to him, and whether this is a religious threat to them, whether it's threatening the religious system they have in place. And so there's these different things going on. People are marginalising him in the conversations for different reasons, and sometimes it's not even about him. It's actually about a bigger argument or and that happens in politics, right? We move from, and we see it even with the COVID stuff. We move to this slanging match between state governments and federal governments about all these things, and we're actually ignoring the people that
the
are
real issues
right
that are actually going on. And you're very right about these bigger political dynamics that can essentially just completely undercut the potential impact that takes place, or the ability to listen. You shared a story this morning, which I don't want anyone to miss out on. I just love what you shared around the Sabbath rules for the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees were obviously a religious group at the time that held quite a significant societal power, particularly among the Jewish people. Obviously, they were currently under Roman rule, but nevertheless, from a community standpoint, control around religious practice and around community and even access to, I suppose, economic means and that type of thing, they had quite a lot of power. And this idea that this event, this healing that occurred and on the Sabbath and therefore breaking the Sabbath was a big deal. Can you share a little bit story about how rules, or at least in the first century, how rules can be both created and then subjugated?
Yeah. So the Pharisees, right back at their beginning, the Pharisees formed as a group, as a movement between the Old Testament and the New Testament in that 400 years, and they had this passion to be people who helped their nation be blessed by God again. They never wanted to be sent into exile. They never wanted to be punished by God. And so they had this desire to see that. And they had this rule, this saying, this philosophy, the vision statement that said, if all of God's people could keep all of God's law for just one day, the kingdom of God would come. And so they were passionate about being a nation blessed by God again. But what they then did is one of the ways they tried to do that was, again, try and set up the right systems without actually looking at the people. And that's what Jesus got them in trouble for all the time. But one of those rules was the commandment, thou shalt remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And they worked really hard. It was an important rule to keep the Sabbath. So they tried to help people. And they're brilliant at trying to break it down, especially in our human nature where we want to find loopholes all the time. And so they started with remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And one of the things they decided that you couldn't do on the Sabbath was work. And then as you know, this happens, it evolves over time, of course, but one of the things that was talked about working was traveling. Traveling was considered work. And so they had this rule that you couldn't travel too far on the Sabbath. And so people then, of course, would want tighter definitions, as we often do. And so what do you mean by travel too far? And, well, you can't travel more than a mile. And so then the pushback eventually was, well, more than a mile from where? Yeah, and so move to, more than a mile from your home. Well, how do you define home? You know, so you can see, like, this is what we do, right? If you're going to make rules for me, I want to know. It's the same with COVID-safe rules, right? You know, when you say this, do you mean this or do you mean this? When I have to check in, do I have to check in? Is it me that checks in? One person per family? You know, where we're finding ways around it all the time. And so, so they said, okay, so no more than a mile from home. Home, therefore, is the place where you cook your meals. That's the place where you establish yourself and you cook your meals. And so what people did, the Pharisees included, was create these little portable kitchen camp ovens that they carried around with them. And as long as they weren't more than a mile from that place where they cooked their food, which was, you know, there, they could travel anywhere they wanted and they walked anywhere they wanted. And so in trying to help people keep the rules, they also found ways to the Pharisees were brilliant. How can we break the rules and keep them at the same time?
Yeah. Which is, and the reason, I suppose, one of the reasons I want to make sure you share that story, not just to get some great insight into the human condition and the way that we too seek to do that, and potentially at the cost of actually neglecting the very real needs of the people around us, even as Christians today, is because you reflected that, you know, particularly as going through Bible college, when you approached stories like even the one that we're exploring today, you know, they would ask you the question, hey, who do you resonate with in the story? And I don't know, maybe there's people here tonight who kind of put their hand up and go, man, I feel like the guy blind from birth. But for many of us, particularly if we've been part of church for a while, the people we're identifying with is the Pharisees, isn't it?
We start to do that. And when you really understand who the Pharisees were and what they were trying to do, and try and relate that to who are the Pharisees now, you know, let's be honest, probably it's most of us. Like the church
That's the risk,
sits
isn't it?
in that place of trying to help people know God, wanting our nation to be blessed, praying for our nation, working towards our nation experiencing revival and spiritual awakening and all those things. And we've got to be really careful. I have to be really careful that I don't keep putting myself in that place where I think I know better.
And I suppose this is the crux point, particularly for us, even as we consider, like, what's our challenge for tonight? Because as this story continues to unfold, like you say, there's a conversation that kind of occurs among the people, and then there's like a first conversation that occurs among the Pharisees, and then they call this guy back in. And I'm just going to actually read from the little passage here. This is ESV. For a second time, they called the man in who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God. Now, this is actually important. Again, their intentions, as far as we kind of have to attribute best intentions to them. They did actually have an end in mind that was notable and honouring. But they said to him, we know that this man is a sinner. Right? And they're referring there to Jesus. They didn't know. We know that this man is a sinner because he defied the Sabbath. And the man answered, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. But one thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. And again, they said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? Again, what are they doing there? They're getting caught up in the...
Well, this guy really just becomes, even though he's the guy that's experienced, he becomes the conduit for their bigger political question, right?
Absolutely. And he answered them, I have told you already and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Like, isn't that just a great moment of sass? I just like this guy who's just like, I can't help but picture this guy who would have been begging on the street. Like, speaking of that, the mental kind of poverty aspect, like this guy who was begging on the street, right? To then be so bold and frank and just like he knew what he was going to get by saying this, to say to the Pharisees, why are you so interested in this guy? Are you wanting to be his disciples? Like, can you speak to any of that? Like, that change from him. Like, what jumps out to you in regard to that?
Isn't it? And we see this with this guy throughout the story. He just becomes bolder and bolder and bolder, and sort of starting to realize what's going on for him, starting to, I guess, process the healing that's happened and how different his life now is. But to then be able to stand up and actually have his voice heard in a way that he's been sitting on the side of all these conversations. Once he's invited into the middle, it's like, well, okay, I'm just going to give it to you. And he does, and it's brilliant.
And it's actually a real big wake-up call for us, particularly with this sense of going, hey, how are we not ensure that we don't miss what God is up to in pursuit of perhaps our idyllic kind of rules-based system, when the very person who is being served can become the mouthpiece of God, right, to actually challenge and shake us out of our box that we've put God in all ourselves.
C.S. Lewis says that suffering is the megaphone of God. And so God uses all sorts of things to get our attention. And so we can so often be just caught up in our own agendas that we either dismiss it or miss it. Yeah,
absolutely. And of course, the response of the Pharisees is to
they got upset.
They get upset, of course they do. In fact, enraged, I believe, enraged.
Yeah.
And I think they just kick him out from memory.
Yep, that's it. They can't go any further with him, and they kick him out.
What a shame!
They call him you're a filthy, rotten sinner. Like you've always been. We know who you are. So they've made up their mind and they label him and they say you've always been a sinner. And even though you may be able to say you see now, you're still stuck in it. We know who you are.
Yeah. And wouldn't it be a shame if, once again, each of us, as we consider the different ways that God is at work around us, were to be so deaf, you might say, or actually, the irony, so blind, as Jesus points out a little bit later on, to not actually be witnesses of what God is up to and just to remain in place in spite of what God is doing. So, I mean, what that speaks to obviously the work of BWA, but also to our individual lives.
Absolutely.
Just to wrap up, this story, and I encourage you, please do go to John chapter 9 and read this story. We're kind of, we're working our way through it, but go back and read this text over again, be amazed by it again. But to wrap this up, there is one final encounter between this man who was born blind, has been healed, and then Jesus.
Yeah.
Right. So it says in verse 35, Jesus had heard that they'd cast him out and he went to find him. And he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And what was the guy's response?
Well, it's really interesting because we need to remember this guy has never seen Jesus, right? Jesus appeared to him. Jesus did all the things, spoke to him, made the clay, and then sent him off. And so Jesus comes in, even the fact that Jesus hears about it and goes and finds him is an interesting reflection. We don't have time for that one. And Jesus says to him, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the guy said, I don't know who that is. Tell me who it is so that I can put my faith in him. And Jesus, I get emotional every time I read this line. Jesus says, you're looking at him. You're looking at him. And I've read that I don't know how many times. It was only a couple of months ago that I read it. I mean, he really means you're looking at him. Like, you can actually see him. And such a powerful moment. And the guy just falls down at Jesus' feet and worships him. And his life is transformed spiritually. What fascinates me about the story is we still don't know what happened after that to him. He's back in that community still.
That's right. Yeah,
but
he's still experiencing.
He's had this moment, this encounter with Jesus. It's transformational.
Nice. And so I suppose we kind of conclude this time. Thank you so much for it's been fun just kind of like throwing some stuff around. But I conclude with what Jesus actually kind of this whole story. Jesus wraps up with a statement, and he says this, and I just want to spend just a minute unpacking it. With the man down there saying, "I believe," and worshiping him, Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Now, that's kind of a confusing thing because it sounds complete. You know, those who can't see, like this man who had been born blind, can now see, and those who, can see will become blind. Now, Jesus there isn't condemning all those who do see to blindness, but he's saying, I'm coming in as judge here. I'm coming in here to actually change people's perception of what it means to see. And there's going to be an opportunity for people to respond in different ways, and depending on how you respond will determine whether you indeed are blind or whether you indeed see. And so I think that's a challenge for each of us to once again look at our world, recognize the different forms of brokenness, have that heart for that shalom that God desires for our world, and to be people who see, whether that is because God is transforming our lives and bringing us from that place of poverty, whether it be spiritual poverty or physical poverty or whatever it might be, and to ensure at the same time that we don't become like those Pharisees who are closed off to what God is doing. Any final thoughts? I just kind of tied a bow on that thing.
I was just thinking the translation I used this morning, the Passion Translation, says in the same verse, "If you would acknowledge your blindness, then your sin would be removed. But now that you claim to see, your sin remains with you." And it's just like this. Again, the way you set the agenda for yourself, the way you claim to understand God, can actually be a barrier to actually experiencing what God's doing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I hope you enjoyed this kind of different kind of style of like our sermon tonight. I would love to pray with you.
Great.
Is that all right? And then we're gonna close with some worship. If you have some Q&A. Still definitely up for that, but maybe we'll just kind of do that at the end. We'll be available for some Q&A, and if there's some really great insights, I'll email them around or something like that. But let me pray for you. Jesus, we just want to thank you that Steve could share with us tonight and this morning. God, we just want to pray that the work of Baptist World Aid would continue to bring about those kind of stories that we heard earlier of community transformation. Lord, we want people to know you, God. And we know that is your heart, but we also want people to experience the fullness of your kingdom, which is wholeness, which is living the way we were created to live, with restoration between us and you and each other and our inner selves and the earth. And so, God, we invite that holistic kind of healing to not only occur in our lives, but in this world. And so, God, would you give us open eyes to see not only where you are at work, but where you might be prompting us to take action on the behalf of others, particularly those who find themselves in some form of poverty. Jesus, we recognize even here in Alice Springs, there is poverty around us. And Jesus, we don't want to be the ones who kind of just stand by our legal and religious precedents and not engage because of that. We want to be people who have arms open, who are open to what it is that you're doing, even if it surprises us, even if it challenges us. And I want to pray for that same kind of spirit to be continually at work within Steve and the team at BWA. God, would they be on the front foot, taking ground in your name. Lord, we want to pray for open doors and for lives transformed. And so, God, we just want to thank you, that Steve and Vicky could join us up here in Alice, and we pray for them, bless them, and the work that they do in your name. Amen. Thanks, mate.